The rancher caught an Apache woman's arrow in midair, and by tradition, she must marry him. John Harris had always lived a life shaped by the land. His ranch, a vast stretch of dusty plains and rolling hills in the Arizona Territory, was more than just property. It was his home, his livelihood, and the center of his world. From the time the sun rose until it dipped below the horizon, he worked tirelessly, tending to his cattle, repairing fences, and riding the open fields to make sure nothing went wrong. Life was simple, but it was honest, and John valued the hard work that each day demanded. Yet despite the rhythm of ranch life, he often found himself yearning for something different, something beyond the daily grind, though he didn't know what it was. One late afternoon, as the sun began to cast long shadows across the plains, John saddled his horse Ranger and rode toward the eastern edge of his property. He needed to check the fences there. The winds had been strong lately, and he feared that the cattle might stray if the barriers were damaged. The air was dry and warm, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and earth. As he rode, the landscape stretched endlessly, the mountains in the distance painted in shades of gold and purple by the setting sun. It was a moment of calm, the kind of peace a rancher rarely allowed himself to feel in the bustle of work. Suddenly, movement at the edge of the land caught his attention. A small group of people was moving slowly through the desert, careful and deliberate, as if they did not wish to be noticed. They were not settlers, and their clothes and style immediately told John they were Apache. He had encountered Apache people before, often trading goods or exchanging greetings from a distance, but this group seemed purposeful and wary. Among them, one figure stood out, a young woman who moved with grace and confidence, her eyes sharp, scanning the land with an alertness that made John pause. There was something striking about her, a sense of strength and determination that seemed almost magnetic. John stopped Ranger and watched, trying to remain calm. He knew that any sudden action could be misinterpreted, and he did not want to cause conflict. The young woman's gaze met his for a moment, and he felt a spark of something unexplainable. She was clearly testing him, and perhaps the others were testing him as well. He had heard of Apache customs and knew that gestures, even small ones, could carry deep meaning. Yet, nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. With astonishing precision, the young woman reached back and released an arrow. Time seemed to slow as John saw it fly through the air, a blur of wood and feather aimed directly at him. His first instinct was not fear but reaction. Years of ranch work riding and handling animals had sharpened his reflexes. Without thinking, he raised his hand and caught the arrow in midair, gripping it firmly before it could touch him or his horse. The sound of the arrow snapping through the air and the thud of its tip missing him seemed deafening in the quiet desert. For a moment, there was silence. The young woman's eyes widened, and the group around her exchanged whispers. John's heart raced, though he tried to keep his expression calm. He did not fully understand what had just happened or the significance it held in their traditions. But the reaction of the Apache elders and the way the young woman stared at him told him that this was no ordinary event. There was meaning here, something far deeper than a mere test of skill. Finally, one of the elders stepped forward, speaking in a language John did not understand. His tone was serious, almost reverent. From the gestures and expressions, John could sense that catching the arrow was not just luck, it carried a binding tradition. By their custom, the young woman, whose name John would soon learn was Nyali, was now expected to marry him. The idea struck him like lightning. He respected the Apache people deeply and had always admired their courage and knowledge of the land, but he had never imagined being drawn into their customs in such a direct and personal way. John slowly released the arrow, careful not to appear disrespectful. He nodded slightly, trying to show acknowledgement, though he did not yet know how to respond to what had just occurred. Nyali's eyes were fixed on him, not with fear but with intensity. She seemed to study him, as if deciding whether he was worthy of the role fate or tradition had placed upon him. It was clear that this was a serious moment for her as well, one that could determine the path of both their lives. The wind shifted, carrying the soft rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. John dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible to show he meant no harm. He approached Nyali with careful steps, each movement deliberate, trying to convey respect and sincerity. The elders watched silently, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, heavier than any fence he had ever repaired or cattle he had ever guided. This was not just a challenge of skill, it was a challenge of character, of understanding, and of respect. As he drew closer, Nayeli held out her hand, a gesture that surprised him. It was not aggressive, not demanding, but an invitation to acknowledge what had just happened. John hesitated, then took her hand gently, his grip firm but careful. The contact was brief, yet it seemed to convey an unspoken agreement. They recognized each other's courage and presence. For John, it was a strange and humbling moment, one that made him aware of a world beyond his ranch, a world full of traditions, honor, and deep human connection. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the desert. John realized he had been standing there, caught between the life he knew and the life that might now be expected of him. He thought of his ranch, of the solitary days and nights spent tending to cattle, and of the quiet evenings by the fire. Nothing in his life had prepared him for the possibility of marriage tied to an ancient custom, yet there was something compelling about the encounter. Nayeli was not just a stranger, she was a symbol of a world he had respected from afar, but never truly understood. And now, by chance, skill, or fate, he was a part of it. The group began to move on, signaling that it was time to leave. Nayeli did not walk away immediately. Instead, she lingered for a moment, her eyes still fixed on John. It was as if she were testing him further, trying to discern whether he would embrace the path the arrow had opened or shy away. John felt a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. He did not yet know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain. His life had changed in an instant. That single arrow flying through the air and caught by his hand had altered the course of his existence, opening a door to a story that neither he nor Nayeli could have anticipated. As the Apache group disappeared over the ridge, John remained standing in the desert, the arrow still clutched loosely in his hand. He looked at the horizon, the colors of sunset painting the sky with streaks of orange, pink, and purple. The desert seemed alive in a way it never had before. He felt a strange mixture of excitement, fear, and wonder. The world was bigger than his ranch, bigger than the routine he had known. And somewhere in that vast landscape, Nayeli was watching, waiting, as if the land itself had conspired to bring them together. John knew that he would have to think carefully, learn, and prepare for whatever came next. But for the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive, as if destiny had nudged him onto a path full of mystery, challenge, and potential. The arrow, simple and unassuming, had become a symbol of a new beginning, one that would test his courage, his heart, and his ability to step beyond the life he had always known. John Harris felt a mixture of awe and uncertainty after the encounter in the desert. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the evening sky was painted with deep shades of purple and orange, but the colors did little to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. That arrow, the one he had caught without thinking, was more than just a challenge of skill. It was a binding tradition, a symbol of a responsibility he had never expected. He knew he had to understand what it meant, but the deeper he thought, the more complex it became. The Apache people were proud, wise, and deeply rooted in their ways, and now, somehow, he was drawn into their world. The following morning, John rose before sunrise, restless and uneasy. He went about his chores, feeding the cattle and repairing fences, but his mind kept drifting back to the desert, to Nayeli, and to the arrow. He had heard stories of Apache customs, of bravery tests, and of traditions that governed every part of life, but he had never imagined being part of one himself. Questions raced through his mind. Was Nayeli willing? Would her people accept him? Could he truly live with someone whose life, beliefs, and culture were so different from his own? Despite the uncertainty, there was a spark inside him, a curiosity and admiration that made him want to learn more. As days passed, John tried to continue his work as usual, yet the memory of the desert encounter remained vivid. One afternoon, he decided to ride toward the ridge where the Apache group had disappeared. He wanted to observe, to understand and perhaps, if fate allowed, to speak with Naeli again. Rangers' hooves kicked up clouds of dust as they moved across the dry plains, and John felt a strange nervousness, as if stepping into unknown territory. His heart raced with every step closer to the ridge, and his mind played out countless scenarios of what might happen if he approached them. When he reached the edge of the ridge, he saw signs of recent activity, footprints in the dirt, small fires that had been used for cooking, and belongings carefully arranged. He paused, unsure whether to step closer or retreat. He knew the Apache people valued respect above all else, and intruding on their space without permission could be seen as an insult. Yet, he also felt an undeniable pull to understand the meaning of the arrow and the expectations placed upon him. Taking a deep breath, he carefully called out a greeting in the limited Apache words he had learned from older settlers. Naeli appeared first, her eyes sharp and calculating. She did not seem surprised to see him, but there was caution in her gaze. She stepped forward, her posture calm but assertive, signaling that while she would hear him, she expected respect and honesty. The elders remained behind, observing silently, their expressions serious and unyielding. John dismounted slowly, showing his hands and keeping his voice gentle. "I did not mean to offend," he said, "and I want to understand." Naeli studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly, then softening. She spoke a few words in Apache, which the elders quickly translated. "You caught the arrow," they said, "and now you are part of what tradition asks, but you do not yet understand what it means to live within our ways." John nodded, feeling a mixture of respect and trepidation. He realized that this was no simple obligation. It was a lifetime commitment to learn, adapt, and honor the customs of a culture he barely knew. Over the next few weeks, John tried to immerse himself in the Apache way of life. Naeli guided him, teaching him small lessons about daily practices, the meaning of gestures, and the importance of respect. At first it was challenging. The world he had known, fenced lands, cattle, and long hours of solitary labor, was very different from the communal, tradition-rich life of the Apache.
Yet, he found himself fascinated.
He observed how they moved with purpose, how they communicated silently with gestures, how they respected the land and each other. Every lesson was both humbling and enlightening, and John began to understand that this experience was reshaping him as much as it was teaching him about Naeli's culture. Despite his growing understanding, tension remained between them. Naeli was proud, independent, and cautious. She had been raised to value strength, courage, and wisdom, and she did not easily trust outsiders, even those who followed her traditions. John's bluntness, common in a life of ranching and solitary work, sometimes clashed with her careful observation and thoughtfulness. He would rush to action, while she would pause, weigh consequences, and plan. Yet each misunderstanding became an opportunity to learn. Over time, they developed a rhythm of communication, a way to bridge the gap between instinct and reflection, tradition and necessity. One day, while tending to small goats that the Apache kept nearby, John noticed a group of local ranchers riding through the plain in the distance. They stopped and shouted, curious about the strange camp near the ridge. John felt a surge of nervousness. If outsiders interfered, it could disrupt the delicate balance between him and Naeli's people. He quickly approached the elders, explaining the situation in words carefully chosen to show respect. The elders nodded, and Naeli signaled him to stay calm. Together they waited, showing unity and quiet confidence. The ranchers eventually passed without incident, but the event left John shaken and more aware of the responsibility he now bore. At night, John and Naeli would sit by small fires, exchanging stories. He learned about her childhood, growing up learning to hunt, track, and respect the land. She learned about his life on the ranch, the long days, the challenges of weather and livestock, and the dreams he had for the land he loved. These conversations were more than words. They were bridges connecting two worlds, building trust and mutual understanding. John realized that the arrow had not just chosen a partner. It had opened a door to learning, growth, and connection. However, not all moments were calm or easy. John still struggled with doubt. Could he truly live within these traditions without losing his own identity? Could Naeli trust him fully? And how would the world outside, the neighboring settlers, the ranchers, and the government respond to their union? These questions haunted him, yet he knew that hesitation could not guide him forward. Each day he reminded himself that respect, patience, and sincerity were more important than pride or fear. A turning point came when Naeli invited John to participate in a ceremonial hunt, a tradition that was both a test of skill and a lesson in understanding the land. He rode alongside her and other members of the group, moving carefully through the rugged terrain. The hunt required patience, observation, and silent cooperation. At first, John struggled. He was used to charging forward with his instincts, but here, a single wrong move could ruin the effort. Naeli's calm guidance, the elders' quiet instruction, and his own determination gradually helped him adapt. By the end of the hunt, John felt a sense of accomplishment and connection he had never known. It was more than success, it was acceptance. Through these weeks, John and Naeli began to develop a bond that went beyond the arrow and tradition. They laughed together, shared challenges, and discovered mutual respect. Naeli admired John's willingness to learn and adapt, while John marveled at her intelligence, courage, and wisdom. Their interactions were not always easy, but each challenge brought them closer. Slowly, John realized that this journey was no longer just about tradition. It was about partnership, trust, and a growing understanding that love, respect, and courage often came hand in hand. Yet, even with progress, uncertainty remained. Both knew that the path ahead would not be simple. They had to navigate the expectations of the Apache elders, the opinions of the surrounding settlers, and the challenges of blending two worlds. Each day required careful thought, humility, and patience. But in the quiet moments, when the desert stretched endlessly and the sun dipped low, John felt a growing certainty that this was the right path. The arrow had chosen him, yes, but his heart, choices, and efforts would determine the life he would build alongside Naeli. By the end of this period, John realized he was no longer the man who had caught the arrow out of instinct. He had begun a journey of understanding, respect, and discovery. Naeli was no longer a distant figure in the desert. She was a teacher, a companion, and someone who challenged him to be better. The arrow had sparked the story, but it was their shared experiences, conversations, and challenges that were shaping what came next. John understood that to honor the tradition, he needed to honor her culture, and the lessons of the land itself. And so, life continued, day by day, moment by moment. John worked, learned, and listened. Naeli guided, tested, and observed. The elders watched, approving quietly when they saw sincerity, cautioning when mistakes were made. The desert, vast and endless, became a classroom, a testing ground, and a witness to a story that was unfolding slowly, carefully, and with profound significance. By the time the weeks turned into months, John Harris was no longer just a rancher. He was part of a living tradition, a world of courage and wisdom, and the beginning of a story that neither he nor Naeli could have imagined at the moment the arrow flew through the air. The days grew longer and warmer as spring settled over the Arizona plains. Yet the growing closeness between John Harris and Naeli was not without its challenges. Though they had begun to understand and respect one another, there were moments of tension that tested both their patience and their resolve. Life on the border of two worlds, the ranchers and the Apaches, was never simple, and the deeper John entered into their customs, the more he realized how much he still had to learn. One morning as the sun rose in pale orange light, John mounted Ranger and rode toward the Apache camp. Naeli was already there, preparing a small fire for breakfast. She glanced up as he approached, her expression unreadable. Though there had been laughter and shared lessons in previous weeks, today there was a quiet seriousness in her eyes. John sensed immediately that something was on her mind. He dismounted and approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Good morning," he said, offering a small smile. Naeli nodded but did not speak. Instead, she gestured for him to sit nearby. John did so, aware of the stillness around them. The elders were gathered a short distance away, watching quietly, their eyes sharp and attentive. The desert was calm, almost too calm, and John felt a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension. Nayeli spoke finally, her voice soft but firm. "You are learning," she said, "but the path you walk is not easy. To live among us you must face challenges, not just of skill, but of heart and understanding." She paused, letting the words sink in. John nodded slowly. He had expected difficulties, but hearing them spoken aloud brought a weight he had not fully imagined. Living alongside Nayeli and her people would require more than respect. They would demand courage, humility, and unwavering patience. The first challenge came the next day. John was asked to join a group of hunters who were tracking a herd of deer through rugged terrain. At first, he thought it would be simple. After all, he had hunted on his ranch before. But this hunt was different. It required silence, coordination, and absolute attention to detail. Nayeli led the group, moving gracefully over rocks and brush, while John stumbled behind, trying to follow her rhythm. He felt clumsy, his city-bred strength and instinct working against the subtle movements needed in the desert. At one point, a loud snap of a branch under John's boot startled the herd, sending the animals scattering. Nayeli's eyes flashed with disappointment, and the elders murmured softly among themselves. John's heart sank. He had not just failed at the task. He felt as though he had failed the trust of the people who had welcomed him, and more importantly, Nayeli herself. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but words seemed useless in the silent, tense landscape. Nayeli, though frustrated, did not scold him. Instead, she signaled him to follow and continue. Her quiet guidance was both a challenge and an opportunity, teaching John the importance of patience and observation over force and speed. As days turned into weeks, John faced more trials, some physical, others emotional. There were moments when he felt completely out of place, unable to meet the expectations of the elders or understand the unspoken rules of the group. He struggled with the routines of Apache life, the meticulous care required in hunting, tracking, and understanding the land. He stumbled over small tasks, misinterpreted instructions, and occasionally acted too quickly when patience was required. Each mistake was a lesson, and each lesson came with a mix of frustration and determination. Meanwhile, Nayeli was both a guide and a challenge. She tested John not only to see if he could follow instructions, but also to understand the deeper meaning behind them. Sometimes she would ask him to track a rabbit silently for hours, watching how he reacted when no action seemed necessary. Other times, she would expect him to remain patient as the elders shared stories of the land, the sky, and their ancestors. John often found himself struggling with a slow pace, used to quick decisions and instant results on the ranch. Yet he also began to see the wisdom in their methods. There was power in patience, strength in quiet observation, and courage in knowing when to wait rather than act. Despite the difficulties, there were moments of connection that reminded John why he was enduring the challenges. One evening, after a particularly long day of training in tracking and observation, he and Nayeli sat near a fire. The stars stretched endlessly above them, and the desert was silent, except for the soft crackle of flames. Nayeli spoke of her childhood, of learning to navigate the land, hunt, and survive. She spoke of her people's history, the lessons of ancestors, and the pride she took in her culture. John listened intently, realizing that the traditions were not burdens, but a source of strength and identity. "Why do you test me so?" John asked softly after a long pause. Nayeli's eyes met his, steady and calm. "Because you must prove more than skill," she said. "You must prove respect, patience, and understanding. If the arrow brought you here, it is not enough to simply hold it. You must learn to live with its meaning." John nodded, feeling the truth of her words. He had caught the arrow, yes, but it had also caught him, drawing him into a world that demanded more than he had ever known. Challenges continued, and so did the quiet tension between them. There were times when John questioned his own abilities, wondering if he could ever truly belong in a world so different from the one he had always known. He missed the simplicity of his ranch, the control over his own land, and the independence he had taken for granted. Yet he also felt a growing bond with Nayeli, a connection built not just on attraction but on respect, shared effort, and mutual understanding. Every difficulty they faced together seemed to strengthen their relationship, teaching them both the value of patience and perseverance. One afternoon, while John was helping repair a broken fence near the camp, a sudden storm blew across the desert. The wind howled, carrying sand and dust that stunned the eyes. Naeli and the elders moved quickly to secure their belongings, but John struggled to keep pace. He was used to dealing with challenges, but this storm was relentless, testing not just strength but endurance and composure. At one point, a strong gust nearly knocked him off his feet, and he realized how vulnerable he truly was in this environment. Naeli appeared at his side, steadying him without words, showing that courage and strength could also come in quiet, supportive ways. By the time the storm passed, John felt exhausted, but alive. He had survived, yes, but more importantly, he had begun to understand the resilience required to live within Naeli's world. He saw how every action, every decision carried meaning beyond the immediate, shaping relationships, respect, and trust. He was learning, slowly, that strength was not just in the hand or the horse, but in understanding, patience, and the ability to endure without complaint. Through these trials, John and Naeli began to develop a deeper understanding of each other's hearts. There were moments of quiet laughter, shared stories, and mutual admiration. Naeli began to trust John's sincerity, even when he faltered. John, in turn, grew to respect Naeli's wisdom, courage, and independence. They realized that the arrow had brought them together, but it was their shared experiences, struggles, and efforts that were shaping the bond between them. Yet the journey was far from over. Both John and Naeli knew that challenges lay ahead, including the expectations of the elders, the judgment of outsiders, and the personal doubts that still lingered. Every day required effort, understanding, and courage. There were no shortcuts, no easy answers, and no room for pride. Yet in the midst of these challenges, something remarkable was happening. John was becoming part of a world he had never imagined, and Naeli was beginning to see him not as an outsider but as a partner, someone willing to learn, to endure, and to grow. By the end of this period, John Harris understood that the arrow had done more than choose a partner. It had chosen a path of patience, courage, and deep connection. He realized that life with Naeli would not be simple or easy, but it would be meaningful, full of lessons, and guided by respect and trust. Each challenge he faced, each trial he endured, was a step toward a bond that could survive hardships, celebrate triumphs, and build a shared future. And so, as the sun set on another day, John sat beside Naeli near the fire, feeling the warmth not just from the flames but from the growing understanding between them. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a witness to their journey, their struggles, and the lessons they were learning together. John knew that he was no longer just a rancher, no longer just an observer of a distant culture. He was part of something larger, something that required patience, respect, and courage, and he was ready to continue walking this path, one step at a time, with Naeli by his side. Spring had begun to fade, and the desert was taking on the golden heat of early summer. John Harris had changed more than he realized. His hands were tougher, his mind sharper, and his respect for Naeli's people deeper. Yet, even as he grew in understanding, there was an unspoken tension between him and Naeli. The arrow that had brought them together still loomed over their lives, not as a threat, but as a responsibility. By Apache tradition, the arrow meant that Naeli was bound to marry him, but that bond could only work if John truly embraced her world, and if Naeli trusted him fully. Both knew that respect alone was not enough. Their hearts, their choices, and their efforts would determine the future. One morning, John rose early, feeling the weight of expectation. He saddled Ranger and rode toward the ridge where the Apache camp had been set. The desert air was cool, but a sense of urgency clung to him. He had begun to understand the customs, learned to observe patiently, and proved his courage through countless trials. But he could not shake the feeling that the ultimate challenge still lay ahead. Naeli met him at the edge of the camp, her eyes steady and calm. But there was something in her gaze that suggested a moment of truth was approaching. "Today you must decide," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. John paused. "Decide?" He had faced countless tests: hunting, tracking, patience, endurance, but this was different. It was no longer about skill or courage in the desert. It was about heart, choice, and commitment. He understood that she too had to decide, not because tradition forced her, but because her life, her values, and her freedom were part of the bond the arrow had created. The elders gathered in a semicircle, their faces serious. Their presence was both comforting and intimidating. John felt the history of their people in their silence, the wisdom of generations who had maintained traditions, respected the land, and lived by principles that balanced courage with patience. He realized that this moment was a test unlike any other. It was not about proving himself through action or skill, but through sincerity, understanding, and willingness to embrace a shared life with Nayeli. Over the next hours, John spent time with Nayeli, walking through the desert, observing the land, and reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He thought about the first day he had caught the arrow, the nervous tension that had rippled through the group, and the journey that had followed. He remembered the failed hunts, the quiet lessons, the moments when patience had been more important than speed, and the nights spent near the fire sharing stories. Each memory was a reminder that this bond was built not on obligation, but on effort, understanding, and mutual respect. Finally, Nayeli spoke again. "You have learned," she said, "but understanding is not enough. You must show your heart, not just your hands. If you choose to follow this path, it will not be easy. You will face challenges from the land, from outsiders, and from your own doubts. But if your heart is true, it will be stronger than any fear or obstacle." John nodded. He understood. To live with Nayeli, he had to embrace her world fully, not as a visitor, not as an observer, but as a partner. It was a choice that would require courage, humility, and perseverance. In the following days, John prepared himself in both practical and personal ways. He continued to work alongside Nayeli and the elders, showing that his respect was consistent and sincere. He participated in hunting and tracking exercises with more confidence, using patience instead of haste. He learned to observe the smallest signs of the land, to interpret the movement of animals, the changes in the wind, and the patterns of the sky. He discovered that understanding the desert was not just a skill, it was a way of thinking, a rhythm that required listening, observing, and adapting. At the same time, John reflected on his own life and values. He thought of the ranch, the independence he had cherished, and the life he had known. But he realized that his life had expanded beyond its former boundaries. Nayeli had taught him lessons that could not be learned in solitude: the value of patience, the strength of quiet observation, and the depth of courage required to face life's uncertainties. He understood that to honor her and her culture, he had to let go of pride and ego, to embrace change, and to open his heart fully. One evening, as the sun set and painted the desert in gold and crimson, Nayeli invited John to join her for a special ceremony. It was a quiet event, held near a small cluster of rocks where the elders had marked a sacred space. The ceremony was not grand or elaborate, but it carried the weight of tradition. Firelight danced across the faces of the elders as they watched in silence. Nayeli spoke words that John did not fully understand, but their meaning was clear. The arrow had chosen, but the choice of life together required mutual commitment. John felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. He had faced many tests, yet this one was different. It was not about proving skill or endurance, but about demonstrating sincerity, courage, and heart. He took a deep breath and looked at Nayeli. He saw not just a strong and intelligent woman, but a partner whose life and values he had come to respect deeply. He realized that he did not simply want to follow tradition out of obligation. He wanted to walk this path because his heart had chosen it. He spoke slowly, his words deliberate. "I will honor your people, your culture, and your ways. I will face the challenges, endure the hardships, and grow through the lessons. My choice is to walk this path with you, not because tradition demands it, but because my heart has chosen it." Nayeli's eyes softened. The elders exchanged quiet nods, acknowledging that John's sincerity had been proven not by action alone, but by understanding, effort, and reflection. The following days were filled with preparation for their shared life. John and Nayeli worked together, combining their skills and knowledge. They repaired fences on the ranch, tended to livestock, and navigated the desert, blending the traditions of both worlds. John learned to balance patience with action, observation with instinct, and respect with independence. Nayeli learned to trust his judgment, his sincerity, and his willingness to embrace her culture. Together, they built a rhythm of life that honored the past while shaping a shared future. Yet challenges continue to arise. Neighbors and settlers sometimes question their bond, unable to understand the significance of the arrow or the depth of the relationship it had created. John faced moments of doubt, wondering if he could truly integrate both worlds without losing himself. Nayeli, too, felt the pressure of expectation, aware that their choices would ripple through the community. But they faced these trials together, finding strength in partnership, shared effort, and mutual respect. Each obstacle became an opportunity to demonstrate commitment, courage, and understanding. Through it all, John realized that this part of their journey, the decision, the acceptance, and the preparation, was perhaps the most important. The arrow had brought them together, but it was their willingness to choose one another, to respect each other's values, and to embrace both worlds that would determine their future. The lessons he had learned in the desert, from patience to courage, from observation to understanding, were not just skills. They were the foundation of a life he could share with Nayeli. By the end of this period, John felt a quiet certainty. The fear and uncertainty that had accompanied him since the first arrow had been caught had begun to fade. He understood that the journey was ongoing, but the path was now clearer. Nayeli had taught him that commitment was more than words or actions. It was respect, effort, and heart. He was ready to face the challenges ahead, not alone, but alongside someone who had become his partner, guide, and equal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, John and Nayeli stood together near the fire. The elders observed silently, acknowledging the choice that had been made and the bond that had been strengthened. The desert, vast and eternal, seemed to witness their decision, carrying the lessons of the land, the wisdom of the elders, and the courage of two hearts determined to walk a shared path. John knew that the journey was not over, but for the first time he felt a deep, unwavering sense of purpose, connection, and hope. And so, life moved forward. John had embraced the path, not just as tradition demanded, but because he had chosen it with his heart. Nayeli had trusted him, not because she had to, but because she had seen his sincerity, courage, and willingness to grow. Together they prepared for the future, knowing that the arrow had brought them together, but their hearts and choices would determine the life they would share. The journey of challenges, growth, and understanding was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid, and the path ahead was theirs to walk, side by side. The summer sun blazed over the Arizona plains, casting long golden shadows across the rugged land. John Harris and Nayeli had spent months walking the path set before them by the arrow, by tradition, and by their hearts. Every day had been a lesson of patience, respect, courage, and understanding. Now, as the heat rose and the cattle grazed quietly in the distance, a sense of calm settled over them. It was a calm earned through effort, reflection, and growth. They had chosen each other, not simply because tradition demanded it, but because their hearts had chosen it. And now, they were ready to live that choice fully. The Apache elders gathered one morning, the sun just peeking above the distant hills. Their presence was both solemn and reassuring, a reminder of the weight of tradition and the wisdom of generations. John felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. He had faced many tests over the past months, hunts, challenges of patience, and trials of endurance, but this moment felt different. It was the moment when words, intentions, and sincerity would be measured as much as skill or courage. Nayeli stood beside him, her expression calm yet strong, a reflection of her people's pride and the strength she had carried throughout their journey together. The elders spoke in their language, their words carrying the weight of centuries. John listened carefully as Nayeli translated, feeling the gravity of what was being conveyed. They acknowledged the journey he had taken, the lessons he had learned, and the respect he had shown. More importantly, they recognized the sincerity in his heart, the commitment he had demonstrated not just through actions, but through patience, understanding, and humility. It was a moment of quiet validation, a confirmation that the path they had walked together was honored and respected. With the elders' approval, John and Nayeli prepared for a small, meaningful ceremony to mark the beginning of their life together. It was not grand or extravagant, but it carried deep significance. The desert around them was quiet, the wind carrying the soft scent of sagebrush and the warmth of the sun on the rocks. Fires were lit, and the community gathered around, not as spectators, but as witnesses to a bond built on trust, respect, and mutual choice. John looked at Nayeli and saw the woman who had challenged him, taught him, and inspired him. She had been more than a guide. She had been a mirror, showing him his strengths and weaknesses and helping him grow into someone worthy of walking beside her. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Nayeli spoke of her people, their traditions, and the journey that had brought them together. John spoke of his respect for her culture, his commitment to the path they had chosen, and his gratitude for the lessons she had taught him. As they exchanged words and gestures, it became clear that the arrow that had first connected them was more than a symbol. It had been the beginning of a partnership grounded in understanding, courage, and heart. The elders nodded in quiet approval, recognizing that this bond was genuine and that the life they would build together would honor both tradition and choice. After the ceremony, life settled into a new rhythm. John and Nayeli worked side by side, blending their skills and knowledge. The ranch benefited from Nayeli's keen understanding of the land and animals, while John's experience and resourcefulness helped in managing the cattle and repairing fences. They faced challenges, harsh weather, wandering cattle, and occasional skeptics from neighboring settlers. But each obstacle became a test they met together, with patience, courage, and mutual respect. Life was not always easy, but it was richer, fuller, and deeply satisfying. One morning, as they guided the herd through a narrow valley, John noticed how naturally they moved together. Nayeli signaled silently, and he responded without hesitation. Their partnership had become instinctive, a rhythm that reflected months of shared effort, learning, and understanding. He realized that their bond had grown far beyond the arrow or tradition. It was built on trust, experience, and shared courage. Nayeli, too, recognized how much John had changed, how he had learned to observe before acting, to listen before responding, and to respect the balance of the land in their community. Evens were now a time of quiet connection. They would sit by a fire, sharing stories, planning for the future, and reflecting on the lessons of the day. John often spoke of his life before the arrow, and Nayeli would share her memories of growing up learning the ways of her people. Together, they discovered common values: patience, honor, courage, and the importance of family and community. They laughed together, shared moments of quiet wonder under the endless desert sky, and found joy in the simple acts of daily life. These moments, small yet profound, became the foundation of their life together. Challenges still came, as they always would. Some days brought disagreements, differences in opinion, misunderstandings of cultural nuance, or conflicting instincts. But John and Nayeli had learned the importance of listening, understanding, and compromise. They faced difficulties not as adversaries, but as partners, each learning from the other, each growing together. Over time, these challenges strengthened their bond, teaching them that true partnership required patience, empathy, and courage, not just in the grand gestures, but in everyday life. Word of their union slowly spread to neighboring settlers and communities. Some were skeptical, unable to understand the significance of the arrow or the depth of the relationship. Others were curious, intrigued by the story of a rancher and an Apache woman brought together by a tradition both simple and profound. John and Nayeli faced these reactions with quiet confidence, knowing that their life together was not defined by outside opinions, but by their shared respect, trust, and commitment.
Over time, even skeptics came to admire the strength, partnership, and harmony the couple displayed.
Seasons changed, as they always do. Summer gave way to fall, and the desert transformed with warm hues of red and gold. John and Nayeli continued their work, guided by lessons learned, strengthened by experience, and bound by a bond that had been tested and proven. They began to think of the future, plans for family, growth of the ranch, and deeper engagement with the community. Each decision was made together, blending the wisdom of tradition with the practicality of everyday life. The life they built was not just survival, it was thriving, rooted in love, respect, and understanding. As years passed, John and Nayeli became respected figures in both the ranching and Apache communities. Their story, beginning with the simple arrow caught in midair, became a quiet legend. It was told not just as a tale of skill, but as a story of partnership, courage, and understanding. Children heard of the man who had learned patience and the woman who had trusted enough to guide him. Neighbors spoke of their fairness, their wisdom, and their ability to bridge worlds. Through it all, John and Nayeli remained humble, knowing that the arrow had started their journey, but it was their hearts, choices, and efforts that had carried them forward. Even in quiet moments, the significance of the arrow never left them. It was a reminder of the moment when their lives had changed forever, when a single act of skill and courage had opened a door to a shared life. They often reflected on how far they had come, from the uncertainty and tension of that first encounter, through trials, misunderstandings, and lessons, to a life of partnership, respect, and shared purpose. The arrow had been the spark, but their bond had been built brick by brick, day by day, through choices, effort, and mutual care. On one particular evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert glowed in soft shades of amber and rose, John and Nayeli sat quietly, watching the cattle graze and listening to the wind move through the sagebrush.
The world felt vast and timeless, yet intimate and full of meaning.
John took Nayeli's hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth that had grown between them. "We have come a long way," he said softly. Nayeli smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Yes," she replied. "And yet every day is a lesson, every moment a chance to grow. But I would not change a thing. We have built this together." In that moment, John realized that their story was not just about the arrow, the tradition, or even the challenges they had faced. It was about understanding, trust, and partnership. It was about choosing one another freely, with respect and courage, and building a life that honored both their world. He understood that love, respect, and dedication were not always dramatic or sudden. They were quiet, steady, and enduring. And that was what made their bond unbreakable. Years later, the ranch thrived, the cattle prospered, and the land continued to be cared for with the wisdom of both worlds. John and Nayeli raised children who learned both the skills of the rancher and the traditions of the Apache, bridging cultures with grace and respect. Their life was full of challenges, yes, but also of laughter, love, and deep fulfillment. They knew that the arrow had chosen them, but it was their hearts, choices, and commitment that had shaped a life worth living. And so, the story of John Harris and Nayeli became more than legend. It became an example of courage, respect, and understanding. A tale of two worlds brought together by fate, guided by wisdom, and sustained by love. The arrow had started their journey, but it was their hearts that carried them forward, side by side, into a future they had chosen, built, and embraced together.